quickly cut across to a guest joining us, Dr. Louise Blair, Head of Vaccines and Epidemiology at Airfinity, a health data and analytics company. Dr. Louise, thank you very much. We want to understand from you the COVID-19 scare that we have yet again 3 years on. China is really exploding. Their health infrastructure maxed out. US is fearing a surge in their country. India is, of course, currently preparing itself. Tell us, should we be worried?
Well, I think what we're seeing in China is a real increase in cases. They've dropped their zero COVID policy, and following which we're seeing a real surge. And these cases aren't being officially recorded, but what we are seeing is indications in media reports that hospitals are being overwhelmed, and also that there's a significant number of deaths. Now, as always with a large surge in cases, there's always concerns over a new variant emerging from the region as well. So countries such as India are preparing in case any new variants reach their shores.
You know, Dr. Louise, what's your take on herd immunity? I know UK tested it at one point, even though China wasn't really willing to practice herd immunity. It appears now with your health infrastructure maxed out, they have no other choice but to try herd immunity.
In terms of the rate of cases that is occurring in China, from what we can get from indications from media reports, it may be really too late at the moment to ramp up vaccinations in order to significantly make an impact. We know China has been very successful in order to ramp up vaccinations within the country. We've seen a peak of 22 million vaccinations a day, but unfortunately we think that that's too late now, and by the time that they could reach that level of vaccination, the cases may have already at least had one peak within the country. So in terms of measures that China could implement to help slow the impact, it would really be other measures such as, again, going into lockdown, restricting movement and mixing in order to control that number of cases at the moment. Now, of course, with a significant number of people being infected, there will be individuals getting protection and natural immunity. However, there will be the most vulnerable still getting severe disease and risk of death. So while a large majority of the population could get protection via herd immunity, unfortunately it would mean there would be a significant number of deaths in the meantime.
Right. Dr. Louise, a quick word on, since you mentioned vaccines, of course, India has really ramped up its vaccination drive, and we've really achieved it successfully. Our booster shots, would you give any kind of importance and prominence to a booster at this point in time with the new variant?
Well, we have seen with boosters that can raise protection within a population. Unfortunately, with the vaccines, over time, the protection does wane, and therefore, in order to really ensure protection levels within a population remains high, boosters can offer that protection and achieve that.
Right. Dr. Louise, would you have a word on the new variant that's really driving the surge in China right now, the BF7? It appears there are 4 cases that have been detected in India also. What kind of symptoms do we expect, any different from the first few variants that came up?
Well, with variants, unfortunately, there's limited data coming out from China. So while it is suspected there may be BF7 circulating, there could also be other Omicron subvariants. Now, within a protected population, within countries that have achieved high levels of vaccination, we have seen Omicron and Omicron subvariants appear more mild, sort of fewer people getting severe disease. But of course, in China, the levels of vaccination, particularly boosters, and the individuals have had significant time since they've had a booster dose. That may be different within that population as well, so more severe disease still occurring with this Omicron subvariants.
You know, at this point, we know airports across the world had slowed down COVID testing. Do you think at this point it's mandatory for COVID testing to be ramped up? Genome sequencing is also something that India itself has alerted states to carry out on all, at least most positive reports. Genome sequencing is important now, is what our country has said. But in the meanwhile, to prevent the spread, do you believe in tests at airports?
Well, we've seen significant drops in testing worldwide, not only at airports, but within domestically as well, within countries. So in order to really understand what is happening in a population, we need to increase domestic testing, but also, of course, one site that we could also increase testing is at airports. In addition, genome sequencing has also dropped significantly, a fraction of what we saw earlier in the pandemic, and we're really flying blind when it comes to any new variants emerging either in China, but also, as you mentioned, cases are increasing elsewhere with winter waves, and new variants could emerge there. So worldwide, we do need to increase both testing and genome sequencing.
Right. You know, Dr. Louise, as we see a pattern. It all started with China, moved to the United States, and then you had European countries that was hit by COVID, and then India really suffered during the first and second wave. We see 3 years later a similar pattern. Yet again, China begins with an explosion. US is reporting a surge. I'm not too sure in the United Kingdom. What's the situation as of now? What and how will this pattern end? Is there an end to this at all?
Well, I think COVID is really here to stay. We're going to see increases and fluctuations in cases worldwide. Now, what countries can do in order to protect their populations, as we see with other endemic diseases, influenza, is vaccinate their population and give boosters on a regular basis to those most vulnerable in order to reduce the impact in terms of hospitalizations, ICU and critical care admissions, as well as deaths. So it will be an ongoing battle against the virus, and we do need to ensure that countries do have policies that extend increasing booster vaccinations and also updating vaccines as well. So we've seen many countries start administering updated vaccines that target Omicron subvariants, the BA4, BA5 subvariants, of which we're seeing many of the new variants that are circulating emerge from. So that can also boost protection. So countries will have to continue to update their policies, increase booster vaccination in order to ensure the most vulnerable in their populations are protected, but cases will continue to fluctuate.
Right. Doctor, you did raise a very pertinent point. Updated vaccines. We seem to be, you know, in India particularly, Covaxin and Covishield. Covishield is something that the formula we drew from the United Kingdom itself, and we believe that it's in use in your country too. Do you believe that these vaccines are not compliant with the new variants that are now in circulation?
Well, we do believe that they'll offer some protection against these new variants, but it is a significant drop in terms of efficacy. And we've seen data from updated vaccines that boosting with the vaccines that are closer to the current circulating variants can boost immunity and ensure better protection. So updated vaccines are likely to continue to increase protection within populations as they're rolled out. However, we have seen that a booster from a vaccine targeting the original variants, the wild type, will still offer protection. So if individuals have the option to receive boosters, that will still increase their individual levels of protection.
Well, Doctor, I'm not sure when you say an updated vaccine, does that mean a more potent vaccine to beat the COVID variant? Since you say it's here to stay, I mean, what's the kind of defense that we could really have? Go on.
So in terms of updated, I just mean that it's been changed to target the new variants. So within a vaccine, the spike protein has varied as mutations have accumulated within the different variants. So the new updated vaccines target those Omicron subvariants that are circulating now in order to help boost protection, generate antibodies that are specific to these new subvariants.
Right. With immediate effect, if there are some protocols that you would advise for people across to follow, what would that be? Of course, masks, something that we believe that United States has also given an open declaration for masks to be used in public places. India also now ramping up its protocols. Do tell us, what are the few things that we could follow to escape this new variant?
Well, we have seen what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions really have an impact within countries. So by this, of course, mask wearing is one of them, social distancing, so making sure there is sufficient distance between an individual and if you are suspected to maybe have an infection, isolating if you are ill, so not spreading the virus further if you have a confirmed case. We know many countries have dropped requirements to isolate, but if individuals that are infected do stay at home, they will reduce the number of individuals that they could infect with COVID. But also, as I mentioned, if you're offered a booster, going out and getting booster vaccinations as well in order to help protect yourself and others against COVID-19.
Anything to do with children? We know that vaccines for kids, for young kids, haven't really been rolled out. I mean, they are, not too sure how effective they are, but do you believe that kids must be focused upon vaccination for children?
Well, we have seen many countries roll out vaccinations for children. As you mentioned, different efficacy values appearing from the literature, but we do know that some children are at risk of severe disease as well as at risk of long COVID, so experiencing symptoms for a long period of time.
All right, Doctor. A quick word finally, would we be able to ask what kind of preparedness is London setting up at this point? Because UK was one country who went into herd immunity much earlier. Is that something that you're still looking at even as there's a global surge?
So in terms of policies in London at the moment, as I mentioned, just like many other countries and cities, we've dropped many COVID policies. There's no requirements for individuals, for example, to isolate if they test positive, and it's really down to the individual in order to protect themselves and others if they do become infected. So as I mentioned, significant drop in testing and genome sequencing, and it would be really important that not only the UK but other countries continue to ramp that up. We do know there is an underreporting of cases, not only in China, so at the moment we think China could be experiencing 1 million to 1.5 million cases a day. Other countries, of course, also underreporting. So official figures for cases are something that we can't quite rely on worldwide, but we need to keep monitoring what's happening in hospitals as well as deaths. So in the UK, for example, we're seeing an increase in COVID cases, but also what is a concern is that we're seeing that increase alongside increases in other respiratory infectious diseases. So influenza and RSV also rising in many countries worldwide at the same time as COVID. So a combination of infections impacting our hospitals.
You know, Doctor, these long COVID effects, you know, if one has been infected by COVID, there are long-lasting effects. Would you want to list out a few of them? Is there a way to deal with it? What would be your advice?
So in terms of long COVID, it could be extreme fatigue that continues weeks and months after getting an infection. We also see increased risk of cardiac issues a long time after infection as well. And the real best way to prevent long COVID again is preventing the initial infection. So, for example, vaccination. Both before as well as even vaccination after long COVID diagnosis has also been shown in some studies to reduce the symptoms that are seen by individuals. Therefore, preventing that original infection is always the best way. So as you mentioned, not only vaccinations, but mask wearing and other activities that an individual can do to prevent infection can really help that in the long term.
All right, Doctor, a final word from you to all those anti-vaxxers, vaccine naysayers. What would you say to them? There have been cases of cardiac arrest post the use of vaccine. Not too sure how far that was investigated, but your view on that.
Yes, so I think there is a lot of data now, both from clinical trials but also in the real world, that shows that vaccination can really help protect not only the most vulnerable, but protect against infection and the impact of long COVID. So you will really reduce the risk that you will experience, as well as within a population as well. So there's a lot of data out there really showing the impact that vaccination can have from an infection and the spread of COVID. So in terms of anyone that is hesitant, there is a lot of data out there that I urge you to look at relative to the risk of experience a side effect. The risk of that is very low. It's not zero, but it is very low in comparison to the complications that an individual can have, both from infection and the acute infection, but also long COVID.
Dr. Louise, thank you very much for patiently answering all my questions.
No worries.
Appreciate
Thank you very much for having me.